I would love to just take her little blip about history out of the lost tools. It feels so disassociated facts when she tells you memorize dates. It doesn't matter what dates. Just pick some dates and have your kids memorize them. But when you put that into context with what she's saying here, which is you very quickly need to move from facts to something to hang that on, it makes a lot more sense.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Bensel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-host today is Mystie Winkler. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Registration is now open for our annual spring training, which happens later this month. Our coach is the one and only Rosaria Butterfield, author of a number of fabulous books, including The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert and The Gospel Comes with a House Key. We asked Rosaria to coach us on what we like to call intellectual hospitality. How do we read classics with discernment, handle disagreements with grace, or confront inconsistency and error with love? Rosaria is going to help us with all that and more. Just go to scholesisters.com/hospitality to register. Renee Shepard is back with us again today. You may remember her from our Socratic Trialogue episode last year. Renee and her husband, who were both homeschooled, are now homeschooling their 6 children. She is currently finishing her graduate degree in classical Christian studies at New St. Andrews College, where her favorite things to study are theology, Latin, and literature. Renee brought a lesser-known article by Dorothy Sayers to our attention, and that's what Mystie and I are discussing with her today. We think you will be very interested in how it rounds out what Sayers said in her well-known Lost Tools of Learning. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé every day. Mystie, would you like to go first?
I would love to go first.
We'll go from like fancy to less fancy to unfancy.
I don't know. Well, you started it. You started before me anyway, but I finished before you. I am reading the Dissatisfaction of Hugh of St. Victor.
I just feel like we should pat ourselves on the back for knowing how to pronounce the title.
I'm glad you went before me, and then I had a class, so I got the scoop. Got to hear someone else say it.
I think it was one of you from that class that told me I was right. I felt very satisfied.
So I've read the book and I loved it, unlike others.
Others present.
Some people named Renee don't approve. So.
There were some great quotes in that book.
There were.
I don't really disapprove.
Yeah. It might be a slight exaggeration. But I'm pretty sure that whatever my final paper for my class on the history of classical education, whatever my topic is for that paper, this work is going to feature pretty prominently in it. And so I've kind of been going through some sections over again while reading a book that was recommended for the class. It's not assigned, but it was recommended. Ivan Illich's. And I don't know. Is that how you say his name?
Ilyich, I think. Ilyich. I think it's Ilyich, maybe. I could have made that up, though. It's not sure. I'm not sure.
It's called In the Vineyard of the Text. And it's a commentary on Hugh's Dissatisfaction. It's very good, but it's making me feel like I didn't even read Hugh. So, and that's a little bit unnerving.
It makes me wonder if it's a commentary on a different translation or if he's reading it in the original.
Well, he has 2 translations, and one of them is this translation by Jerome Taylor. and he marks, when he's using which translation. But
interesting.
He's just pulling together thread. Like, it's not walking section by section through it, which I would kind of prefer, because there are sections that I would like a commentary on. It's more that he has themes that he is talking about, and he's pulling quotes from Hugh, like it was inspired, and he is commenting on Hugh, but he's pulling out his own topics.
Right.
So I think he's developing more some of those areas that I might have read a bit too quickly because we had to read it in 2 weeks.
Wow. Yeah. Well, he might be kind of extra textual. I feel like there's the people who are commenting and they're trying to help you understand the text, and there's the people who are commenting that are building on the text. And those are different kinds of commentaries.
It is a little bit more of building on the text. It's not like the Jerome Taylor edition has some great footnotes and different explanatory things on the text. And that is helpful. And this book by Illich is much more than that. But he has a whole chapter on what monastic reading is like. So in some ways, he's just bringing in more history and more background to illuminate what's going on and what would have been his context. And he has a section explaining like memory palace and how they trained the memory, and how different categories for things, how we have different categories than they did. And it's very hard to connect what they were thinking with what we were thinking, just because of the cultural and technological differences that separate us. Like, we just have different conceptions of even how you go about something.
Oh, great. I need the book. I'm putting it on my wish list right this second.
I think I'm going to have to read this one also, because clearly I need a better appreciation of Hugh.
This guy, I ended up getting a couple other of this guy's books, so you might be hearing more about him later, because he has a book called The Tools of Conviviality.
Well, you just like the name.
I was like, okay, we've got to, I don't know who this guy is, but I've got to find out, because we're probably going to get along.
I decided you're right when you called him Illich. I was thinking it was Illy, but it's an I. So
it's Illich.
I think you're right.
So anyway, that's me.
Oh, I found his Conviviality.
Yeah.
And an penetrating analysis of the industrial mode of production.
I mean, sounds like great reading, doesn't it?
It does. Riveting, even. Hey, I found one by him I would like to read. It's called Limits to Medicine.
There you go.
And I'm going to send it to Dr. Fauci and see what happens. Just kidding.
Okay.
On that note, Renee.
My book that I painstakingly chose out of the 25 that I have going right now.
All right.
I thought was the most useful to share. It's called Uncovering the Logic of English.
Such a good book. I love that book.
The reason I love this book is because I have been unsure what to do with one of my children in particular, who is so analytical, it is hard to believe. And he's been really slow to read, and he wants to know the rules to everything. And I've got 4 readers, and 3 of my readers just read very quickly, very easily, as did I. And so I haven't known what to do with this other child. And I've been looking at different phonics programs, all kinds of things. And this book, I felt like, had the answers to everything I was looking for. She goes through and explains that English is not illogical, that it's a really complex language. And she has rules for everything, and basically goes through and explains English, how it works, how the sounds work, how the spelling works, and how to be really literate in the language with an understanding of it. So everything that I've read in here has been immediately applicable. And now I have rules for everything for my kid that needs all the rules.
Isn't that great?
Yes.
I used that book with my kid that was like that. Totally same situation, actually. And after I read it, I actually rewrote part of my phonics curriculum because I realized that there were a couple, she just thought about it more thoroughly. And so I had caught most of the logic, but there were a couple things that were missing. And she's just so good. I love it.
Yeah, it was great. And it has helped my other kids who read proficiently and easily, because certain things I didn't know to tell them, like why is oi, oi, and oy? And then she's got this rule about English words don't end in I, U, V, or J.
Right.
So you have to have a Y, and then instantly they can spell better from this one little memorization.
I love it.
Nice. Yeah. It is. I am always irritated when people say that it's impossible to understand English, or English breaks all of its own rules.
Or it's all sight words.
Right.
Gives me the willies.
Which you have to do because they say English doesn't make any sense. There was a popular online phonics game when my oldest were little. And one of the rules that they were taught in this phonics game was that when two vowels go a walkin', the first one does the talkin'. And I'm like, well, no wonder they say that English breaks all the rules, because that's not like, it's not a rule
Exactly.
if it's only applicable in half the cases. Don't make bad rules and then blame English for breaking your
Seriously.
dumb rules.
Seriously.
She has this part where she says, what if the problem is not the language itself, but the rules that we were taught?
Yes.
The complexity of English as a powerful tool rather than a hindrance. So she had me from the beginning. That was in her opening lines.
Yeah. Somebody gets it.
How about you, Brandy?
Mine, well, I have two books to talk about today. One is a book I am buying because I love to tell you what I've bought and haven't read. And the other is a book I'm actually in the middle of. So I'm going to start with the one I'm buying. And that is just because on my 5x5 challenge, I had a category that Dawn helped me name. What is it? This is my most specific category. It is, I have to look at it to make sure I get it right. 20th century moral philosophy. It was basically because I had some Lewis and Chesterton and stuff I wanted to read, and I was trying to figure out how to put them all in one group when they weren't on the same topic. And so she came up with this really fancy sounding topic for me. So I had a space there, and I had someone write me an email today and talking about some things that are going on politically or whatever. And then she says, I just finished reading Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, and I think you'll really like it. And I was like, ooh, I have never read anything by her, and I've always meant to. It's just one of those authors I've always meant to get to and never have. So I looked it up, sounded really good. So I bought it, which is why I can't buy anything during the show today, because I already bought a book today. But I'm super excited because I get to fill out my my little 5x5 challenge form with somebody who I haven't read before, like a new author I haven't read before. It sounds like a really great book. So basically I'm thrilled. So that was my purchase today. That's future School A. I'll come back and talk about it when I'm reading it. My other School A every day is actually The Complete Father Brown by Chesterton. And I've read probably about half of this before. In my read aloud time, one of my read aloud categories is a book that I read just with my youngest when everybody else is at youth group, because he's the only one that's at home. And especially during the winter, it's dark. He can't really go outside and play. So he asked for this. And I was like, sure, he's 12. It's not like he's little. And we're having a good old time. And I had forgotten, they're very good stories just in themselves, but I had forgotten how many times Chesterton makes those classic Chestertonian observations about life and reality and religion and just all sorts of things.
Very commonplaceable.
Yes, very much so. And it's just so funny to find that in short stories. I think of a lot of short stories I've read, they are in too big of a hurry to be short to be profound. Mm-hmm. So it's very refreshing, which they are a little bit longer too. Every time I read one, I'm like, I feel like my mouth is tired, which is saying a lot considering it's me. So anyway, with that said, that was my School A every day.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather together and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. Sophie membership. It's named Sophie's because the bonuses included are focused on the pursuit of wisdom and understanding in philosophy and education. It is where you can pursue the education you wish you had and learn to pass it on. You will have access to everything that free and supporters do. Plus, you get annual swag at no extra cost. You can find mentorship on the journey of studies in Plutarch, Shakespeare, and so many more. You can expand your self-education with seminars and trainings. We desire to see a grassroots resurgence in the liberal arts, especially dialectic, the lost art of truth-seeking conversation. You can do this too by becoming a Sophie today. Go to scholasisters.com/sistership.
Speaking of lots of words, someone else who had lots of words was Dorothy Sayers, and we're going to discuss some of her words today. How's that for a transition? Ooh. I felt like that was pretty good. Unfortunately, with our new format, no one's going to appreciate it. So, so anyway, Renee is here because this was her idea. She brought this to our attention. This is a different essay by Dorothy Sayers, and it is called Ignorance and Dissatisfaction. Renee, do we know where this came from? I'm calling it an essay, but it's obviously a speech. She's obviously addressing an audience.
Yeah. She gave it as a speech to, let me see, I wrote down when. She gave it as a speech in 1952 to the Association for Reform of Latin Teaching.
Ah, okay. And that is what this is about. This is about teaching Latin. Before we get into the weeds, I just wanted to say that I fell back in love with her. I mean, not that I needed a lot of help because she's just so darn funny. Even in this, there were just laugh out loud funny parts. But I just have to say, I appreciated her so much when she said she's talking about the pronunciation, and then she goes after the classical pronunciation. She said exactly what I said the first time I heard it. And she says, I will say here, and now that I've never discovered, nor can I see any reasonable use or excuse for the Waney Weedy Weeky convention. Then she says, it is not merely that I have a profound sympathy with one of my friends who says he just cannot believe that Caesar was the kind of man to talk that kind of way. And that is exactly what I thought. When every V turned into a W, I was offended. I was like, no, the manliest culture that has existed, it does not talk this way. I just don't believe it. Don't buy it for a second.
Well, and then she uses the example of not reading Shakespeare aloud in his original pronunciation. Like, it doesn't matter necessarily, except, for a special interest.
Yes.
That the pronunciation is exactly the same as what it was originally. That's not the highest consideration.
Yes.
That it morphs with time and culture, and that we go with what it has morphed into, not what it used to be, because that's not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you guys think about this, but I have always chosen the ecclesiastical pronunciation when given the option for, curricula, DVDs, whatever we're buying. Usually, a lot of curricula will offer you audios with either, you just buy whichever one you want. But the reason why I did that is because I was like, the only people actually speaking Latin regularly in the world today are using the ecclesiastical pronunciation. So it seemed to me to make sure that if my children heard Latin spoken aloud, they would recognize it as such because it was in the pronunciation that they had been trained in. I don't know. That made sense to me. Mm-hmm. Now, I say that, I think 2 of my kids are actually getting classical pronunciation in their class right now. But anyway, making the fatal mistake she talks about in her essay of changing pronunciations midstream. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about pronunciation. She has definite tips and thoughts on Latin education that I think all 3 of us felt go beyond just Latin when you really start thinking about the principle underlying her criticism or what she's telling us to do or whatever. So we're just going to go through some of the things on her list that she says, do this and don't do this or whatever. And I picked out to start one of the ones that stood out to me. Since I was making the notes, I get to go first. It was basically, don't go too slow. And she says that on and off throughout the essay in different ways. So, one place she talks about just the average child. She says, I am quite sure that for the average child, and she's saying something else, but she says, for whom it is important not to spend too much time and trouble, not to mention tears upon rudiments. In another place, she says, where did my Latin education starting so well as it did go wrong? Looking back upon it, I feel sure that the trouble was simply that the whole process was far too slow. So she compares it to her French education, and she ends with the idea that French presented me with works of literature which were not only in themselves such as to hold a child's attention, but which were easy enough to be read fluently and quickly by pages instead of paragraphs at a time, and were written in the same language which I was learning to speak. My question when I was reading this wasn't really just about Latin. It was, are there places, just looking at kind of the educational terrain that we all see around us, are there places where we go too slow and things like that backfire, where we're letting children kind of get mired in the rudiments or the details or just not progressing? I know, what is that? Charlotte Mason talks about how his joy is to go on. And I'm wondering how many times we're going too slow in places that aren't Latin. So that's kind of my question for you guys. You can discuss and I'll get my popcorn and listen to you say smart things.
Well, I'll say a controversial thing. I don't know if it's going to be smart. I have a particular pet peeve about this regarding too slow of the reading of books. I think that there's a trend to move really slowly through books. And I'm not saying that there are not books that shouldn't be moved slowly through. I think there are books that should be digested in a slow manner. But for kids, I think we kill some of the enjoyment by going at a painfully slow pace. Maybe stretching one book out throughout the entire year when maybe we should let the kid read the book and go back through it a second time. Or go more at their pace.
I've seen that where it was dragged out for a year and it really should have just been a term. Like that still would have been a slow pace to do it in a term.
Yes.
It's almost like going so slow that you don't really even get a whole thought. And I mean, there is a thought, I'm sure, in whatever slow section, but to get that momentum and to get into the story sometimes takes time.
Yeah,
it does. And I think as I read personally, I tend to read through really fast because I need the big picture.
Yeah.
And then I can go back and read slower and get a lot more out of it, which tells you I might like Hugh better my second time around.
I think you will.
But without the big picture, I have trouble following all of the connections and the thoughts in it.
Yeah.
I just don't do well with little bits and pieces. And I've noticed the same with my children, that they need this arc of where the story is going. And to get to that. And in some ways, I think we do injustice to stories by breaking them into little bitty pieces and making the child chew on them forever.
And to think that we have to get everything out of it the first time through. When, as C.S. Lewis says, you can tell a reader by whether or not he rereads books.
Right.
Yes. And all good books are worth rereading.
Right. I could poke a Charlotte Mason.
It's okay. You're allowed to poke Charlotte Mason.
Names.
Naming any names.
Some people. I think even just acknowledging that rereading is a good thing, actually,
right,
in a valid way to approach a book, that the first time through doesn't have to be your only time through, and holding that first time through as some sacred rite that you have to pass.
You know, I wonder if I should write about this sometime, because I have found this to be a huge misunderstanding among people who have maybe not read a lot of Charlotte Mason, but have read just enough to be dangerous. It's probably the way to put it. So when she talks about a single reading, what she means is before they narrate, not for their whole lives, right? For her, this is a way of training the attention. You read it once and they narrate, you hold them accountable for the information. And it's because if you read it to them 3 times, then it will take 3 times for them to be able to narrate. It's just kind of like the whole don't count to 10 if you don't want to have to count to 10 kind of thing. But she doesn't mean don't reread. She herself was a famous rereader. She just like read the Waverly novels over and over again for like 30 years. She knew the value of rereading. It just wasn't what she was doing in the classroom. And I think sometimes homeschoolers, particularly because our lives are so entwined with our school, don't necessarily draw those kinds of lines. It's fine to reread a book. It's just not what she was doing with narration, if that makes sense. You can still say something you think is going to make me upset.
You know I love to.
Do it.
Well, I think this is even applicable to the books that you are narrating, because there's the conflicting desire to read a small enough amount that they can give I'm doing air quotes right now, adequate narration versus reading enough that they actually start enjoying the book. And it's not just a random paragraph that never actually went anywhere.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think her statement here, pages instead of paragraphs, is very key.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. For sure. I've always thought that's important to get kids where they can narrate a whole chapter at a time, which is tough to do, but they can do it given enough practice. I am wondering if this applies to the idea of not going too slow, if this applies even to non-reading sorts of things. And I know when we were talking about this before the show, one of the things I talked about was I think that has been the fatal flaw in my approach to grammar. That I would be, and this is, I mean, really my going too slow was actually just symptomatic of a type of inconsistency. Something would get us out of the habit and then I wouldn't do it for a while. And then I had to go back. And I feel like we got mired in the rudiments, so to speak, to draw upon her language here, where my children do not know grammar the way they should, considering how many years we've technically been studying it. But I really think my mistake has been going too slow. So my new plan, I actually bought a whole new grammar workbook to just kind of start us fresh. And I'm like, we're just going to do a little bit every day.
Which one?
Easy Grammar.
Okay.
I had a friend send it to me and she's like, I love this. And I thought, well, I'm going to try it because they know some things. I just feel like we need something that will help me be consistent. And she thought that that was the kind of thing that would work if I said, we're going to do this 10 minutes a day instead of 30 minutes once a week. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it'll work out to the same amount of time, but I think we'll be more consistent because we are making it a daily habit instead of like a weekly habit. I don't do well with weekly habits, guys.
Well, one day throws the entire thing off. I have trouble with that too, unless that's one reason why I do classes with other people where they show up at my house at a certain time on a certain day, because then it happens.
Yep, I totally, yeah. It's funny, the 1 year that we did Plutarch at home and not in a co-op was the year that I only managed to get us through one life because I was just like, blowing it off half the time.
Anything where you are belaboring content and they don't have that feeling of making progress and getting somewhere and doing something with the knowledge that's interesting. Mm-hmm. That can happen with math. That can happen with grammar, a lot of things.
I think you could argue math from both sides. I mean, you don't want to get bogged down sticking with the same facts, but you do need to go slow enough that your children have a solid grasp. I mean, that's one of those things mastery is really important in.
True.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think we can blanket statement, don't go slow, but the too slow is really important. And you've got to know your student to know what is too slow for them or too fast for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I've had some kids that I let speed up and do, double lessons or whatever because they were getting bored, honestly, because it was it was one of those things where it was quote unquote too easy, but I knew they couldn't just jump a section.
Yes. Right. Or they might not be quite ready for the next thing if they move.
Yeah. So I would let them just go faster or even say you only have to do half of the problems on this page or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or feeling like you have to do every problem on every page of your math curriculum, which it's like, no, you should have them do it to mastery. But if you go beyond that, just because the material is there or just because you want to be extra sure, it might not actually be helping.
No, it might cause a dislike of the subject because that is really tedious.
Yeah. I think I made some of the math and grammar connections in that quote where she talks about with the average child, it's important to not spend too much time in trouble and tears upon the rudiments. It may be what it is about math and grammar. To me, I think the temptation to spend too much time on the rudiments is because we know it's kind of mastery based, you know? And so that's the temptation is we got to make sure we've got it. Like my child that has a memory issue, realizing, you know what, I'm making her hate math because I'm holding her back because of her memory, but she actually knows what she's doing. And if I just let her use a multiplication table, we could move on to something more interesting and not still be doing our multiplication facts.
Great example of don't go too slow, I think.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly enough, I felt like a lot of those things started coming together for her as she got what you were saying, the bigger picture of math, that some of it connected up in her brain. I mean, the memory issue is still there, but it's actually not as bad as it was when we were just focused on it.
Yeah, I remember liking math a lot more once I got to algebra.
Yeah.
And was using more of the concepts instead of just drilling concepts.
Yeah. Well, unless you're counting money, addition's kind of boring. Well, let's do another one of her tips. Another thing she talks about is starting at age 6. And she's very clear in her essay that was just what you did. Her dad wasn't making any special decisions for her. It's just as she was 6, getting closer to 7, he knew that it was time for her to start Latin because that's when they started it. And I love the way he says, basically, he looked around and since there weren't any boys, he taught her. Which I just died. Anyway, she says she is convinced that the age at which she began was the right one. And her emphasis seems to be upon memorizing the declensions more than anything else. You can correct me if you disagree. So I'm wondering your thoughts on this. I know one of the things we were going to do was kind of compare some of this to what she says in Lost Tools of Learning.
Well, I think we can't stop there, though, because her emphasis, she's giving an account of what her education was like. And she makes it clear that the ignorance and dissatisfaction is hers, that she believes herself ignorant of Latin and she's dissatisfied with it. So the way that she learned it didn't work.
Right.
I don't think she's saying she thinks it was right. I think she says the components she had needed to be there, but it was a failure because the other very necessary components weren't there.
Like the reading?
Yes. So she did need... There's a section in here that's very Lost Tools where she says at the time that children love to memorize, you need to be giving them the declensions and memorizing what should be memorized. But the problem with her education was that there was no speaking and reading added in with it. And so Latin failed for her because it was only rote memorization, which is really a pushback on Lost Tools, on some people's version of her Lost Tools of Learning, that it should just be rote memorization in those young years. She's saying here, with nothing to connect that to, without the literature and the speaking, it was a completely failed education.
Which is so sad. Really. Well, she even says that. The saddest part about this is that she actually had the gift of tongues. So the idea that it didn't take with someone like her, she recognizes her giftedness.
Who spent 20 years studying
it. Well, honestly, you guys, because I'm on the board of a classical school and we're looking at curricula, I've been looking at Latin curricula from a very different perspective. Choosing curriculum that I think is going to work for our little family with my specific children is very different than trying to pick something that I think is a sure win with a large group of children. And so I'm looking at things I've never looked at before. And almost every curriculum I've looked at, I've thought, well, that's all great, but I don't think they're actually going to read any Latin. I do not see this producing children that read Latin. I could be wrong, but I'd be very curious. I don't know. Like, I'm wondering if we're still doing this kind of mistake where we're studying Latin for an extended period of time. We're not actually producing Latin literate children. It reminds me of my own Spanish education because, like, it literally didn't dawn on me that I was trying to learn to speak Spanish. I know that sounds so dumb. This is right up there with me writing on trash. I feel like this is like the problems with being me. But I I was just trying to get through a class and I was doing the tricks.
Right.
And it never crossed my mind that I would become bilingual or something. I feel so lame saying that. When I was looking at it, I felt like, and I could be wrong because I haven't actually been in the position of the student in the class using these particular curricula that I've looked at. But so many times I was looking at it thinking, I think if I was in this classroom, I would be able to do all the tricks, but it would never dawn on me that I was actually learning Latin. But I can't figure out exactly why that is. Could be, Renee, exactly what you're saying, because you're not ever going to read pages of it the way that these particular curricula are set up. Maybe high school, but not any time in the early years.
Right. And most of the curriculums I've looked at have a speaking component really only in chanting and not in saying these students need to be talking. Now set up a time that they're conversing with each other. Here's the tools that they've learned, and hold a conversation and converse with the teacher and use what they're learning. And you can only memorize so much before your brain just stops storing it because it doesn't need it. And that's what she says when she got to the point at Oxford where she got moved to modern languages for the remainder of her degree, and she instantly lost all the Latin because she didn't need to hold on to it anymore to pass any classes.
So if you don't have a way and a reason to use it, then you do lose it. It's not like just a problem with a cram and test mentality. It's a learn anything. But if you don't have some way to incorporate it into your life, some way to use it, then it's just not going to stick.
Do you think she criticizes people for waiting till 11, which is close to what I do? I wait till more like 9 or 10, not quite 11. And one of the reasons why she says this is that you're missing that chant. So let me read it instead of paraphrasing her and doing it badly. This is in the context of where she's talking about, I'm convinced that the age at which I began was the right one, which was 6. So then she goes on, she criticizes those who are not beginning until 11. And then she says, I remember them now. She's talking about a little Latin chant thing that she's recited in this context. And she says, I remember them now, although I have not the faintest recollection what any one of the words mean except papilio. I could not possibly forget them any more than I could forget hic, haec, hoc. And it is all nonsense to pretend that small children hate and are bored by learning things by heart. They like it. They have a passion for it. If they are given no outlet for this passion in school, they will devote themselves to memorizing number plates or cricket averages. I'm assuming that by small children, she means 6 and 7-year-olds.
Well, if we reference her lost tools, her grammar age is 9 to 11. So she's expanded that to rising 7. So I would say late in a 6-year-old year versus early, and extend up to just before 11, I suppose.
Have you ever raised, and this is a question for both of you, have you ever raised any children or known any children who did that sort of thing, where they were memorizing number plates, cricket averages, like they were memorizing random stuff?
In the cases that I can think of, which none of the answer is no for my children, I do have friends' kids that have something similar to that, but I wouldn't call it random, like number plates. I think there's a big difference between memorizing license plate numbers, which I think she means by number plates.
I literally have a child who did that, by the way.
Oh, okay.
So it is a thing that happens. But I'm pretty sure he thought he was spying on everybody in the neighborhood. Like, I think there was more to it than just...
Yeah, right. There's a reason for it. Because I say the cricket averages would be equivalent to, baseball averages and the statistics. Right. Where they have an interest in the subject.
Right. And they care how well their player's doing or whatever.
Rattle off all these stats that are meaningful to them. But my children have never done that.
If you know children who have done this, how old were they?
Mine have never done this, but I give them a ton to memorize, and they have phenomenal memories. So I think this is a trend with young children that they are great at memorizing. And I think her point is not, I think she's making a point that is not as age-based as it sounds. She sees children at a certain age hitting, why are we doing this? And so it's not so much the young versus old, it's the pre-questioning of why do I have to learn this? And she says her father taught her the declension for table, mensa, that she was delighted. She loved just knowing it. She loved studying Latin, and she thought it was all wonderful. And there is a thing where young children are delighted at what they can memorize, even younger than 6. I remember my kids being thrilled when they could learn a little poem and want to tell it to everybody. Whether they understand what they're saying or not, they're just delighted at their learning. So I think she's talking about when you're in that stage of them not saying, why do I have to learn this? That you need to hit it with the things that you want them to have memorized for life.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
That's fair. I think what I was picking up on, the reason why I was asking this, is because I've actually known lots of little boys that were doing this kind of thing, including one of my own. And they were all 9 to 11, all of them, without exception. None of them were that young when they were actually initiating memorizing these extensive, things of numbers and that kind of thing. So part of me was like, I see what she's saying, but I don't really see that at age 6. I see that for things like poetry and music. Mm-hmm. And I think there are occasionally gifted children that do enjoy things like a Latin declension. Like I would never say no to a child that wanted to learn a Latin declension, regardless of their age. But I just don't know. I don't know that I see it in 1st and 2nd grade. I don't know that I see its utility, even if we want to, that it would give them, I don't know.
So the end of Lost Tools, when she gives her age ranges, which was written before this address, 5 years before.
Yeah.
So she'd been thinking on this for quite a while. Her grammar age student is 9 to 11.
That's why this surprised me. But then I felt like, but I think she's probably a very gifted person, and she hasn't actually taught children ever.
Right.
I wonder if she's looking back and she's seeing herself. But I'm wondering if her at age 6, almost 7, was like most kids age 9 or 10.
Well, but she's also saying don't wait to do Latin until they are in that 11, 12. Like that shouldn't be where you start. And there's a big difference between a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old.
For sure. Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, and think about how in our culture, we save all languages for even high school in a lot of states. I mean, I know some homeschoolers are exceptions, but when we talk about the curriculum across the country, they're waiting way longer than that. And it does seem to be detrimental. We don't produce bilingual people as a general rule.
It would be interesting, or maybe one of you guys knows, to look at other countries that do language studies. I mean, many other countries have children who are fluent in multiple languages, at what age they're starting.
When Misty and I talked with the Rafiki school women who teaches they run schools in Africa, it sounded like from the very beginning, didn't it, Misty? That like from age 6, they were receiving their instruction in English.
Though that context, they're in countries where in the homes, they might speak a native language, but they are only in countries where the language of commerce is English. So they send the missionaries go to countries where they don't have to learn a language before they start.
But I'm just thinking, so those children are actually receiving bilingual education from the time they're tiny. As soon as they go to school, at the very latest, as soon as they go to school, experiencing 2 languages.
I only actually know my friend that's in Ghana, and there everyone just speaks English.
Even in the home?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
But in a lot of countries, and like even here, Dorothy Sayers is talking about her French governess.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fairly common, where you just have someone in the home who is giving instruction or speaking only in this other language. And so it's woven into life more than it's, here, we're going to spend 30 minutes a day using this book to teach you a language.
Well, and doesn't she even say about how, here it is. She's talking about her French governess, and she says you cannot possibly hope to get the same results as by individual teaching. You can give French lessons in French to the more advanced forms, and you can encourage the acting of French plays. But basically she's saying but nothing makes up for the fact that I had a governess.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is why we get into a lot of these things being generational work, because they're just not there's not a second language in my home, Latin, French, or any other. And so I hope that by giving my children rudimentary things like this, that maybe it can be more like a second language in their homes when they're raising their children. But a lot of us can't afford to have
which even that takes a lot of work. I have multiple friends who are bilingual, and to actually pass that on to your children, a lot of them have a hard time.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of the families I've seen doing it, it's usually the oldest child knows the second language.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is a good point to say that she goes on. I don't think she's only making a defense for learning Latin to its fullest extent as if it could be used as a spoken language.
Right.
And
right.
Values to learning Latin, whether or not you become fluent in it. A lot of her points are the benefits towards learning our own language better, learning other languages, using it as a stepping stone towards the other Romance languages.
Yeah.
And understanding of grammar, in which case fluency is not, it doesn't have to be the end goal for it to be a worthwhile study.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciated that about her perspective here, in that she is saying that we should have more reading and more use of the language while we're learning it. And yet the reason why we're learning it isn't necessarily so that we can, she doesn't talk at all about reading authors in their primary text.
You mean reading not reading translations, but reading them in the original? Okay.
Yeah, she's not talking about our goal is to read Caesar, Cicero. Like, that's why we're studying it. She has a lot of good reasons for why we should study Latin. And an effective way to study Latin would be to actually read things that are maybe even not the great Latin authors, which I think makes it approachable, because she is saying that even if you forget some of it, like she did, she still counts it learning the Latin grammar as one of the most important foundational things she learned.
Well, and the funny thing is that her speech is littered with Latin, so clearly
it is.
She knows Latin pretty well.
Yeah.
I know. It's kind of frustrating to me, actually.
I'm reading, okay, this is just full of insider jokes. If I knew Latin, this would probably be really funny.
It only took me 30 minutes to get the joke in the opening paragraph.
Now I've got to go back and look that up.
Oh, it was Virgil. Yeah, it was a Virgil quote where she's basically saying that her story, her tale of woe about Latin is tragic, like her own education.
Oh, yes, where she quotes the Aeneid.
Yeah. I'm looking at, for example, Minimus, where in Minimus Latin, they have like the Latin comics, and then they actually have a whole set of readers that are kind of like Bob books that are kind of graded and get more sophisticated as they go on. So we have that. We have Cambridge Latin now. We have, what is that? Lingua Latina and Pars Romana, where it's just like they're reading these stories and they get more sophisticated with each chapter. And I'm just wondering if she would love what is available now compared to then.
I think so. I think she'd be thrilled with what we have going on versus what she had in her time.
I was actually encouraged that for all the things that I looked at and was frustrated with, I felt like I could get a grasp of what she probably would like from what she said here, and actually find examples of it in real life that you could actually purchase these curricula and use them, which is nice. Mm-hmm. I also found it interesting. So she says to read easier texts, and she talks about using the Vulgate. I found this interesting because I had someone take me to task for suggesting that we should read the Vulgate before we read Caesar. I mainly said that because my student that does know Latin pretty well, who is a graduate and wants to go on in Latin as a graduate student, he is the one that actually started basically by reading the Vulgate. Mm-hmm. And he loved it. And I think it was even a dumbed down version of the Vulgate where everything was in the present tense for the first few lessons and then moved on to other things, if I remember correctly. And anyway, I felt very vindicated. I'm like, if Dorothy Sayers said it, it might not be that bad that we did it that way. But it was fun for him to know Genesis chapters 1-3, because he's a little boy and he knows those pretty well. And then to be asked to try to read them in Latin. He had a good old time with that. And then I was kind of made to feel by someone who knows Latin or whatever, like this was some sort of inferior way. But I don't know, listening to her, I feel like Dorothy Sayers would be like, yeah, that's great.
I think it builds an affection also, because
right,
they are using it and doing it right off the bat, and they think they know it. In some ways, that is the important thing, because they're going to go on to learn it better. Whereas if they think, I don't know this, I can't do it, I don't understand it, they're not going to commit to going on and learning this better at a later time. And she says something about if as far as you get is the medievals with their poor Latin and sometimes good presentation, then that's great. And if you're really good at it and you keep going on and you can read the classical stuff, that's even better. But there's nothing shoddy about only getting so far.
It's still valuable even then. And that reminds me of the Quintilian quote, above all, we must take care that the child who's not yet old enough to love his studies does not come to hate them.
Mm-hmm. Amen. That goes for a lot of things. I actually loved the idea that they could read the medievals. I mean, for a couple reasons. And one being that in many ways, the medievals are a more direct line for our personal inheritance because they were Christians. But in addition to that, our children could have access to great ideas in an original language, even when they cannot yet read the ancients. That was just very encouraging to me. I was not really aware of much beyond the Vulgate until in the last few years. I knew there was a lot of Latin scientific treatise stuff out there, but I wasn't really aware of how much was out there and that it was easier reading. I don't think I saw the potential for my children to have access to original texts like that.
And we have a far greater catch of works that is extant from a medieval time. There's only so much
True
of the classical age that has survived.
She gets into the Christian part of it here. I love this. Our civilization, such as it is, remains in its living bones a Christian civilization, and the Augustan Latin was never Christian. Even those who most roundly assert that Christianity is dead bring it to the bar of their inherited Christian values, and by the concentrated rage which they bring to its obsequies, proclaim that it is in many ways disconcertingly alive.
But if it is dead today, it is because the classical scholars killed it by smothering it with too much love.
Yes.
That everything which is alive tends to break out into vulgarity at times.
Smothering it with too much love. That just, I don't know why I got this picture of are you guys aware of the Looney Tunes character Elmira? She would like pick up an animal and be like, I love you. I want to hug you and squeeze you and love you forever. Yeah. And they're like, heads are popping off about because she's holding them so tightly. It reminded me of that. Okay. Another tip that she has is choose a pronunciation and stick with it.
I think that should be followed up by as much as depends on you, because as you pointed out, like sometimes you don't get to decide.
Right. You're not the teacher and shouldn't be. I shouldn't be the teacher, just to clarify. Basically, one of her big complaints is that because the pronunciation was changed on her and then changed on her again when she joined a choir, so she has like these 3 different pronunciations, she felt very disoriented by that. That harmed her progress in Latin. To her, this is a very personal issue. She feels personally harmed by that. I was wondering if we can think of other areas where this applies. Is this kind of like choosing a math curriculum and sticking with it? When we start jumping around, we can sometimes do harm to our students. Not that there's never a reason to change, but sometimes we do harm just by not being consistent.
Yes, and amen. One of my hills to die on is not jumping ship on curriculum on a whim. because especially regarding math, most curriculums don't follow the same sequence. So unless you make a really informed decision and you're going to make up what is going to be lacking and you're sure they're going to get it somewhere down the line, you are harming your student if you drop one curriculum and jump to another and jump to another. They're not going to be able to follow as well. Mm-hmm. So not that some don't work. There are times, like you said, to do it, but I think we're too quick because we have the blessing and curse of so many curriculum options now.
That was a piece of advice that I received and took to heart before I got started. There was a mom in our church, and her youngest is the same age as she's a little older than my oldest. And she'd been homeschooling all the way through. And she said if she had one piece of advice or one thing she could do over, she would not switch math programs. She would have just stuck it out and gotten supplemental help. Whenever one of her daughters was having a hard time with math, she would think that a different curriculum might, be a better approach for this student.
Oh, yeah.
What became apparent after a few years was that there were just so many gaps because of the different sequencing of the programs. So she told me the curriculum she would have stuck with, like if she had to do it over again, because she'd also tried them all at that point. And so I was like, all right, that's what we're doing. And we're sticking with it. And we have. For each student, we've brought in some different kinds of helps along the way. But part of it has also been the assumption sometimes math is going to be hard. That's just one of the good reasons why we study math, is to do hard things and to stick with it until we get it.
I think part of our issue too here comes from feeling inadequate. Sometimes we just don't feel like we have mastery over this subject. And so if it seems like a curriculum isn't working, we feel like we can't fix it. So we become really curriculum dependent in areas where we feel weak, but
that's true.
We have to hold loosely and modify it. It will not work as written for every single student. Any curriculum, even the best curriculum, is not going to work across the board for every student. So we've got to be willing to move around in it, modify it, teach it different. And with math, that might look like looking up outside videos, giving them another perspective, but not clinging to the curriculum as our saving grace, because it might not be the right thing for our student to learn in that section, and they just might need some extra help.
That's probably why I've used 4 different Latin programs. Because we have zero competency here.
Yeah, I own quite a few Latin curricula now too. Oh, I know not everyone can afford a tutor. And I mean, the reason why I was teaching Latin for many years was because I couldn't afford a tutor, but I am a firm believer in a good tutor, especially for Latin. Yeah. I mean, I always think we can stay a few chapters ahead of our students in so many ways. But what I found with my oldest was that we reached a point where, talk about going too slow, the reason why we were at the pace we were was because of me. He was ready to outpace me, but I was his teacher. And so my mere existence was holding him back. So getting him into a class where he could go at a faster pace, which was just an appropriate pace. It wasn't like a whirlwind sort of pace. It was just faster than mom, who has a zillion other things to think about as well. It was so good for him. And I feel very grateful that we were able to do it. We found somebody who was just starting a business. And so it was really cheap at the time. I'm a firm believer in a Latin tutor if we can swing it.
Outsourcing is a wonderful help in homeschooling. I remember being so overwhelmed when my 4th student came into play. And that was the year that we began outsourcing more with our oldest. And unfortunately, the things that get outsourced are the things I really want to teach.
Right.
But I'm not going to pay someone to teach phonics to my little kids. So
right.
Part I get, and someone gets the fun stuff with the older students.
That totally happened to me. I was like, I will teach all of high school except chemistry. I don't want to teach chemistry. Junior year with my oldest, that was the only thing I got to teach. It was awful. I felt like someone stepped on my toe. Terrible. The things we sacrifice for these children. Okay, I'm going to go through these tips. So I know we're getting late, but I want to go through the different tips in her and just see if we've missed anything. So she says, catch them young. 11 years old is too late. They are beginning to think. 2, this is great. Throw that dreary man Cicero out of the window and request the divine Virgil with the utmost love and respect to take a seat along with his fellow Augustans in the first consul until your pupils are ready to be ushered into the presence. 3, choose a pronunciation and stick to it. That's what we just discussed. 4, start your youngsters off upon the medieval syntax and the easiest and simplest medieval texts. And then she admits that there are not books. Let the reading go as fast as possible, getting on to long, sustained extracts as soon as may be. And then she says using a crib if necessary. And what does that mean? She used the word crib multiple times, and I kept meaning to look it up.
No, I was imagining some sort of like an English word stacked on top of the Latin word.
That's what I was wondering too. Yeah. Or like one of those books where I know I have a copy of Faust where it's like one page is German and one page is English. Okay, we'll just go with that.
Or a glossary, like a word list.
Yeah. 5, if possible, let them speak Latin in class. These aren't actually numbered in the essay, just so you know. I numbered them. Let them write simple proses. And here is where I wondered whether something like those easy readers that come with minimus, I wondered if that would lend them to being more able to do this kind of thing. Because those little minimus readers, I haven't read all of them, but I remember one of them we read around Halloween. It was like a ghost story. It was like some creepy spirit guy. and I just was thinking, like, how do you talk about everyday things if you're not getting the language of everyday things? And I'm wondering if a curricula like minimus would allow for that. Renee, have you ever looked at minimus?
I have, yeah. The pace was too slow for us, but I did like it for the accessibility.
So what Renee's saying is the pace was perfect for Brandy. So moving on. Who needs a little more time to think? 6. Misty will like this, I think. Let them get up their classical myths and general background in English. It would do no harm to introduce them to Ovid and Virgil in a good translation if you can find one.
Really important to her. Her last Latin paragraph, that's what she's reiterating, that it's really important to love. Don't butcher the stories. Keep the stories intact and let your student love them, and they will love the language more.
Well, that makes sense with the experience of your son and the Vulgate.
Yeah.
Where there's already a love of the text. And so now you just get to experience it in a different language, and that's cool. It's not, here's something completely unknown and unconnected, translate and figure out what it is.
You know, I just remembered this. Did you guys know you can buy Harry Potter in Latin?
Yeah. I did know that.
We have Winnie the Pooh in Latin.
Oh, yeah. You know what I've heard? I've heard that is actually a really high sophisticated form of Latin.
That makes me feel better because it was incomprehensible to us.
I bought that for my oldest at one point, and I don't know if he ever read it. I mean, he looked at it and stuff, and I think he thought it was cool, but I don't think he was able to read. I thought he would be able to read it, but I think it was harder in Latin than it was in English. And I don't just mean because it was another language. Her last one, number 7, when the time comes, that is when they can read with ease and have a decent vocabulary, let them go on to the Augustans in the original. So any comments on that?
Well, I like that she points out there in that section that you're having them read it as literature. And she says, intended to be enjoyed as such. Pick the exciting, moving, and memorable bits. And so even here where they are enjoying the original, they aren't doing it as an exercise in Latin anymore. Like by the time you are able to do that, the point is enjoying using the language.
Well, she also says this is your moment for wrestling with a little more difficulty than the difference between modern English and the English of Chaucer. So if you've read Chaucer,
who let Eeyore show up here? Come on.
Chaucer. I had to read Chaucer on the original.
Yes, same.
And Spencer.
There's a bit of wrestling that goes on there. So,
yeah.
But it's not Eeyore, because the point is that it's still going to be difficult to go back to that classical Latin and be fluent at that level. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's okay if they never get there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she said the same.
No shame in being a medievalist.
She would definitely say that.
I know there was a part of me that was like, or is she biased because she loves the medievals and she's like, they're good enough for me. I take her point. Yeah. So now at the very end, and we don't have lots of time for it, I would love to know what points of comparison you made, if any, to her thoughts in Lost Tools of Writing. Did it come to your minds? I know we talked a little bit in the very beginning, but is there anything else?
I read this whole thing with Lost Tools ringing in my ears because some of the quibbles I had about Lost Tools I felt were clarified by this. In particular, I would love to just take her little blip about history out of the Lost Tools. It feels so disassociated facts when she tells you memorize dates. It doesn't matter what dates. Just pick some dates and have your kids memorize them. But when you put that into context with what she's saying here, which is you very quickly need to move from facts to something to hang that on, it makes a lot more sense. And then I can look at her section about history and say, it's similar to how I prefer to read books, which is get the overarching thing, and then you can flesh it out, go back and read it again, fill in the information that you need. So the facts are just, you need to learn them, but in concurrence or quickly followed by the lovely information, the books and the stories, and filling it out, not just years and years of memorizing facts.
Mm-hmm. And I think she makes this point in Lost Tools, but I think it's more evident even just in the way she's telling this story, her own story here. And when she is talking about memorizing facts, it seems like her main point there is to say that as teachers, we shouldn't come with these facts and say, okay, now you have to learn these boring facts before you move on. So we're going to chant them 1,000,000 times until you've memorized them. What she's actually saying is that they will enjoy it. So we're presenting it and giving it to them as something that they are enjoying and delighting in. So it's something about the atmosphere and the mood of the memorizing is fun, not dreary facts.
Yeah.
And it is easier for, the younger years before they're 11 or 12. They do come at whatever we're learning with a different kind of energy and delight and wonder. And so we're supposed to be using that as we teach and not killing that, or, maybe even just not even noticing, but we should be affirming that in them.
One of her lines I really liked is when she's talking about learning the declensions, she says, I memorized meaningless symbols and inconsequential lists of things as easy as hey diddle diddle. I chanted the rigmarole aloud until I was familiar with it and hastened away to show off my prowess in the kitchen. That is such classic little kid.
It so is. Actually, right before that, I was thinking about her father's approach. This first sentence of that paragraph that you just read, the last sentence of, where she says, when we had rendered exercise 1, part 2 into Latin, my father rose up and went away, leaving the book with me and recommending that I should commit the declension of Mensa to memory. This I immediately did. I think when my children were little, I think I was kind of overbearing with memory things. I didn't leave it on them. And I noticed, and I think I thought it was because they were older that my approach is more successful now, but I wonder if I didn't leave them independent enough. Once they were able to read, I mean, obviously, if they can't read, then they cannot memorize without adult assistance. But long after they were reading, I was still kind of treating them like babies when it came to memory work. And now that it's basically like, you need to select something in this category, and this category, and it needs to be ready by this date. And I have nothing to do with it. They practice on their own time and they whatever, it's way more successful. I think I thought it was because, well, they're all mostly almost teenagers or whatever, but I wonder if it's more taking that responsibility, it actually goes better.
I was totally too overbearing with my older kids. They were younger.
I suppose for a lot of us, that's true in a lot of areas with early motherhood.
I think all around that's a true principle.
Yeah. And he was a man. They're always more comfortable leaving. Like, you'll be fine. You won't die.
And a part of that is making the learning their own and leaving them to it and expecting it to be enjoyable. And sometimes, we're overbearing or overdo it because we are unsure or we don't know what we're doing. And so we feel like, we have to have that control.
Yeah.
If we realize that this is actually delightful and enjoyable, it might help us lighten up a little bit.
Right.
She had those few lines in there about how much she would have loved Latin, and that had she had an imaginative teacher, I think 2 or 3 times she said that would have been the key to her success in it.
Just a nice way of saying Dad was boring. God bless him. I do see that though when I'm watching Angela read with my kids because she's their Latin tutor. She just is so good with them. And she is a more imaginative teacher. And when she shows up in her toga and her little head thing at class, it has an effect. Well, anything else? Because we probably should be done.
I just love her sense of humor.
Yeah, it's the best.
Yeah, I do too.
But ignorance has seldom prevented anybody from laying down the law about how other people ought to run their jobs and propose impractical solutions. So I will proceed to offer a few.
It is always good to remember with her, though. She's giving her opinions, and they're informed opinions because of her being highly educated and her experience and all that. But she didn't actually claim to be an expert, and it's okay to take her with a grain of salt, too.
Which she reiterates herself several times.
Yeah. She warned us.
And I think it's she has a great story herself that is highly applicable. But that's part of the reason why she couches all of this as her story with this attitude of, these are reasons, but I don't take myself seriously. I'm not asking you to take this as a dictum.
Right.
This is my experience and my thoughts, and let's do something better moving forward.
And she's getting us to think and consider. And that is important. I was trying to find one last funny quote to read from her, and here's one where she says, I don't know if this is a good way to end, but I sure loved this one where she said, there was a horrid Aegean beset with pitfalls and man-traps called oratio obliqua, into which one never entered without a shudder, and where, starting off from a simple accusative and infinitive, one tripped over sprawling dependent clauses and bogged oneself down in the consecution of tenses till one fell over a steep precipice into a pluperfect subjunctive and was seen no more. Oh, I feel like there's this moment in Pilgrim's Progress or something where she just fell over the cliff of grammar. Well, thank you guys for coming. This was fun.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Renee.
Thanks. It was fun.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episode. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolasisters.com/SS89 to check it out. Don't forget to become a Sophie level member of the Sistership. You will get our spring training sessions with Rosaria Butterfield, along with access to all the other wonderful things that are going on, such as the Charlotte Mason tutorial with Karen Glass, multiple book clubs, even our summer gear. Sign up at scolasisters.com/sistership. In our next episode, the whole gang, Misty, Pam, Abby, and me, we're all back together and finishing up the season with a rousing discussion of Augustine's On Christian Teaching. Until then, we want to remind you once again, homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. I made some notes here. And then I didn't share them with you. So there you go.
I think it's super helpful to have notes. Wait a sec. Renee Shepard is not in this meeting. Yes, she is.
Wow. Zoom strikes again.
Ooh, the complete Father Brown. That'll take it out of you.
Oh my gosh. Once again, I've overcommitted. I was waiting for Misty just to make sure.
Let's go.
It can take a while.
Beach ball. Beach ball.
Like, hold on. She's going to throw it back. Give her a second. Okay.